All right, it is Thursday, April 29th, 2021, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and today we're going to break down UFC 261 pay-per-view buys. We've got some numbers coming out of the event, and I'll let you know what it means for the promotion, as well as the drawing power of Kamaru Usman and Jorge Masvidal. Then we're going to talk about Triller suing 12 websites alleging $100 million in damages. I'll let you know what the lawsuit entails, as well as whether or not they can expect to actually get any money out of it. Then we're going to go ahead and move over to some new information that's come out about the UFC and ESPN pay-per-view deal. So through Endeavor's Roadshow, we found out that pay-per-view guarantee money that ESPN was paying the UFC is not actually what was reported on a couple of years ago. So we'll break that down for you. Then we're going to talk Proximo Spirits buying the majority share of Proper 12. What does it mean for Conor McGregor, both inside and outside of the octagon? Will it cause him to fight less, fight more? I'll break that down for you. Then, One on TNT had some interesting events the past several weeks. I'll break down whether it was good for the promotion, bad, and just overall what their first venture into North American television in a series of events really did for One Championship. Finally, I will quickly touch on Jon Jones splitting from First Round Management and what that means for both Jones, as well as why First Round Management may have opted to pull the trigger themselves. Got timestamps in the bottom, as always, and with that in mind, let's go ahead and get right into it. So first thing I want to dive into is the UFC 261 pay-per-view buys. John Orland from the Sports Business Journal reporting that over 700,000 buys came through ESPN+. We don't know the exact number, but you can say it hovered around 700,000, maybe 701,000 to something like that, in that range. Now, it's important to break down a couple things about this. One, this is just the ESPN Plus numbers, so it doesn't take into account global numbers from other providers and from other countries. It's really mostly just US. That being said, when we compare this to the numbers that we do have from UFC 251, when Masvidal and Usman fought last, it is down at least 200,000 from the numbers we have reported. Now, I've mentioned multiple times about pay-per-view buy numbers and being wary of them. For this particular event, I do not trust UFC 251 numbers, the source, all that much. If you search UFC 251 pay-per-view numbers, you're going to find multiple sites reporting a certain range, but all of them come back to one particular source. And that source, again, we've pretty much figured out is just Dana White telling that person who then tells everybody else. So don't necessarily trust those numbers. They may be inflated. But if we do use those as a basis, you're looking at a 200,000 pay-per-view buy drop. Is that bad? Good? Well, here's the thing. I mean, it's obviously not good because it's lower than UFC 251. And with UFC 261 being the rematch, supposedly more hype, full training camp Masvidal, you'd expect a bigger return. But the reason I brought up the wariness about UFC 251's numbers is the real numbers could be closer to this range, right? I trust John Orland and Sports Business Journal to give us solid numbers. They're not always going to be 100% accurate, right? But still, good source. It's very possible UFC 251 did in a similar range in ESPN Plus, and the other numbers were inflated. It's also possible that those numbers were correct, and or even low, right? And or maybe even more than 900,000. It's hard to say, but it's not as big of a deal as a lot of people are making it out to be, right? It's not, wow, like he's fallen off a cliff, and this is a bad deal. And by he, I mean Jorge Masvidal, because his popularity did decline. He got very political, made some moves that didn't really pan out for him in terms of, social media and things like that. A lot of people were saying, yeah, his popularity's down. Not as many people are going to buy. But again, a big part of pay-per-view buys are the casual audience that don't follow a lot of these guys on Twitter or Facebook or where have you. It's not the same ecosystem. they're going to follow these guys and know these guys from maybe seeing them on an ESPN show like Highly Questionable. That, oh, I watched Highly Questionable. I saw Masvidal on there. He's fighting. Sure, I'll check that out. Right? That's a lot of these buys. Much more than the view that a lot of us hardcore fans see, where we see every single thing that Masvidal has done and everything single thing that Masvidal has said, because we're reporting on it, we're tracking it, we're, following him, all that stuff. That's not really the case for a lot of casual buyers. I would be shocked if a lot of casual fans are, on Twitter following Masvidal. I really don't think that's the case. Because if they were, my guess is they'd be more semi-casual buyers or hardcore fans, right? If you're following MMA guys, maybe you have one or two, and I'm sure there are some casual buys that did end up, doing that. But for the most part, where you get that big increase in numbers from the hardcore floor, as I like to call it for pay-per-view buys, of around 200,000, 300,000, it comes from people that are not following the sport almost at all on a daily basis. So that all being said, Masvidal did, come out and do some political things, which I won't really dive into, but may have turned off some people. And his last fight against Usman wasn't particularly thrilling, right? Usman kind of just did his wrestling thing and neutralized Masvidal, got the decision win. So that always hurts a rematch, because a lot of casual viewers are also going to say, because this wasn't that long ago, right? It was last July. They're going to say, oh, yeah, that's great and all, but, I've already seen that fight. How's it going to go any different? Right? They're not thinking about full training camp versus non-training camp. That's not a thing. And if they are, it's just from what the media has thrown at them. It's not a critical factor, I would say, in whether or not they're going to purchase the pay-per-view, I would imagine. So that all being said, 700,000 buys is still a very good number. I saw a lot of people also say, man, he's not a draw anymore. He's not doing as well. That's not the case. 700,000 buys is still very good. Your typical range, again, pre-ESPN Plus was in 200,000 was kind of the floor. Now it's been bumped because of COVID and because of some, extenuating circumstances that have gotten more eyes on the sport globally. But I would still say that in general, your floor is going to be around there. 200,000, something like that. They've had a really good year this year and 2020. They did very well in terms of pay-per-view buys, the UFC. And 700,000, that's, 100,000, 150,000 below Adesanya, who everyone, says is this giant star, and really is, again, the biggest star the sport has that fights consistently, for sure. But, Masvidal's not that far behind. It's really not. And the way things went down with that card, right? It was an amazing card, top to bottom. And you had Kamaru Usman knock out Masvidal, be the first fighter to finish it. Well, in the UFC. Take that back. He was finished outside of the UFC. But first fighter to finish him in the UFC by strikes. That's, a big deal. And that will transfer over some to Usman, I would imagine. Just like we've talked about with the pay-per-view rub, right? Where Nate Diaz beats McGregor and then becomes his own type of draw. Masvidal beats Diaz. Again, becomes a draw. And now you've got Usman knocking Masvidal out clean. And yes, it goes down in degrees. It's not a one-to-one transfer, right? Nate Diaz didn't become as big as Conor McGregor when he beat Conor McGregor. He became big and much bigger than he was, but he didn't, reach McGregor heights. And Masvidal, same, did not become a Nate Diaz in terms of drawing power and, notoriety by beating Diaz, but again, elevated himself out of that kind of hardcore fan base. I expect the same thing to happen here, where Usman will be more of a draw, especially with the way he's finished several opponents and what he did to Masvidal in there at 261. Usman's drawing power will go up. I fully expect that. What it will end up being is hard to say, especially with this being the rematch. But that knockout was so clean, though. So, you have, and you'd have more of a viral potential if you didn't also have, Rose knocking out Zhang Weili and, all the other craziness, the Weidman leg break, obviously, which I hope you missed. But if you saw it, well, sorry, there you go. It didn't stand out as much, but still he will get a rub from this and he will become more of a draw. But how much? I'm going to peg it at maybe 400 or 500,000. We'll see. I mean, we don't have numbers from Burns versus Usman. I know there was that 500K that was reported a bunch, but that number turned out to be false and not verified. So that's not really accurate. But I can easily see him being more of a draw than your hardcore floor performers, right? So I do think that overall, it's still a big win for the UFC. You do have a dominant champion now getting some of that rub, right? Because a lot of people have said, who's going to beat Usman? And that's an entirely different discussion, but he's been so dominant. He's looking so good. If he keeps winning, the best thing you can hope for if you're the UFC is that he gets some of that shine and some of that rub so he's able to draw more. And I think this will help him do that. I think he will start to bring in more, casual viewers. He's not going to be an Adesanya. He's not going to be, at least off of this win or anything like that, but he's going to get a bump. And if he continues to be dominant, continues to fight as often as he has, that's great for the UFC. That's what you want, is you want a dominant champion who pulls in the numbers. You want a John Jones that doesn't derail his career with a bunch of stuff outside the octagon and instead pulls in, 800K, 900K, a mil for particular fights and fights often. That's the dream. And, that's not going to be Usman right now, but even a bump up from 200K to, let's say, 400K is a lot of money for the UFC, as we'll talk about in the UFC ESPN pay-per-view guarantee that we'll cover here in a little bit. It makes a difference. So it's a win for the promotion, and 700,000 just from ESPN Plus is also not a bad day at the office. That's number 2 behind Adesanya's numbers. That's fine. That's good. Very, very good. Especially when you factor in that guarantee. So I think, the people out there saying, oh, it's 1.3 million versus 700. Well, again, A, don't know the 1.3 million number is accurate. B, even if it is accurate, it's global versus ESPN Plus. And I've made that mistake myself, so I'm not judging anybody for that. Just trying to clear that up. And then 3, or C, you still got somebody that's drawing, which is important. And Masvidal won't lose all of his shine either. Masvidal will still be able to bring in crowds. If he fights Nick Diaz, if he fights Chimaev, if he fights, pretty much any striker in the welterweight division, he's still going to bring in casual fans. Is it going to be less than when he was vying for, the belt? Yeah, but, McGregor loss is not like he's pulling in 500K. Diaz loss is not like he's pulling in nothing. I mean, you've got to really understand that it's a good scenario for the UFC overall. You get a dominant champion getting a bump. You get Masvidal to go on and have some fun fights and, be able to still bring eyes to fights that aren't for the belt. And you got 700K pay-per-view buys on ESPN Plus alone. Not a bad day at the office. So do not believe the hype that they're not draws, that it was a bad time for the UFC, that they were disappointed. It's not ideal, especially if the 1.3 million global and 900K through ESPN Plus numbers were accurate. It's not ideal to see that much of a decline, but it's still solid numbers. So we'll see how future pay-per-views and fight nights because I'm assuming Masvidal will probably headline a fight night or two, depending. They may throw him in a 5-round co-main event, similar to what they're doing with Diaz and Leon Edwards. I could see that too. But we'll see what Masvidal does in the future, and we'll see what Usman does when he retains the belt or attempts to retain the belt, rather, on the next pay-per-view that he fights on. We'll see where they're at, but it's not gloom and doom. So just cut that out. It was a good night for the UFC and for fans. It was fantastic. If you haven't watched that card, go back, watch the entire card. It totally worth your time. All right, next thing I want to dive into is Triller is suing 12 websites for allegedly illegally streaming the Jake Paul versus Ben Askren fight pay-per-view. So some of these sites that are listed, you may recognize if you're out, pirating things. I do not condone them, but I have heard of these sites before. So sites like filmdaily.com, crackstreamslive.com, I think is probably the biggest name on this list. Then some just goofy ones that I've never even heard of. Trendy Clips, Mike. What site is named Mike? It's Lil Brandon and does 1 through 100 are both sites. I have not heard of those. But Triller is alleging copyright infringement, violations of Federal Communications Act, conversion, breach of contract, conspiracy, and violations of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So, we've seen this song and dance before a little bit with Dana White and the UFC, where he was going after that streamer, and then apparently was threatened so much that he decided not to stream the pay-per-view. So they didn't get him, but that was a whole thing. This is Triller actually taking some concrete steps to call out, hey, here are the sites that are doing this. We are filing a lawsuit. And I mean, $100 million is nothing to scoff at, right? But there is a reason why these streams exist. I think Crack Streams is probably one of the best examples, right? The laws in the US have changed. And now streaming these events carries much harsher penalties. Much, much harsher penalties than they used to. So there is some real teeth behind, going after these guys. But most of these websites are not on US soil. So what does that have to do with this? Well, that means if I go to court, I'm Triller, I go to court and I sue these websites. I sue Mike, whoever is running that website, or it's Lil Brandon. They're not going to show up in court. They're not going to fly into the US and come to court and say, no, I didn't do this. No, they're not going to do that at all. Instead, what's going to happen is they're not going to respond to the complaint, and Triller's probably going to win a summary judgment, which means that in the US court of law, they will have won these lawsuits and will be owed $100 million. How they're going to collect that money, however, is a whole different question, right? I doubt any of these guys combined, especially, have $100 million between them. I can't see it. And we've seen this type of thing before in other combat sports. Yoel Romero suing the supplement company might be the best example, right? I think he won $27 million or something like that for a tainted supplement. He's not getting $27 million from that company, though. I don't believe he collected anything. I don't believe he was able to collect. It's a much harder thing to collect from someone outside of the US, collect damages, than it is to, prosecute them for blatant illegal acts. And keep in mind, I'm not going to say for certain that all of these sites were illegally streaming the pay-per-view event, but I would not be shocked if they were. I mean, I'm not going to, haven't seen the facts, so always give the proven it, or proven innocent until proven guilty, or innocent until proven guilty. Sorry, it's late here. I always roll that way, but I would be actually very, very shocked if they weren't illegally streaming in the end. I'd be like, oh, okay. But there's a reason why these sites exist and why not everyone in the world goes after them. Because they're not just streaming Triller events. They're streaming, I'm sure, many other events. Tons. Right? Some of these sites are streaming football, baseball, basketball, all this stuff. Why don't any of those guys go after him? That's arguably worth much more money in some cases. And it comes down to, how do you collect from, someone hidden behind a VPN that you don't know where exactly they are? You know what country they're in, but you have to coordinate with, a foreign government to go and arrest them and then extradite them to the US and then bring them and charge them. It's not an easy thing, especially depending on where they're living. If they're living in a country that doesn't have extradition laws with the US, then you're pretty much out of luck. So it's a lot of grandstanding. It's a lot of, hey, we're going after these guys because they stole so much money from us. Could easily be tied into what I talked about last week in terms of where Triller's pay-per-view numbers are out there. The ones that are out there are probably very inflated. I believe are inflated. And so this is a way to kind of, cover some face where, hey, like if financials do come out, or if a more solid report on pay-per-view numbers do follow, they can allege, well, we would have made, $100 million more if not for all these guys. Yeah, that's great and all. And it might just be them actively going after illegal streamers because they're pissed and they feel that it's worth throwing the money at it. But collecting anything from them, I don't see it. I really don't. I think they're going to get $0 out of this. So whether or not they do actually succeed in getting money, this is more PR and more them sending a message than anything else, I think. I think it's more of a deterrent for people in the US to watch streams. There are so many people out there that think, oh man, if I watch an illegal stream, man, I could be hit with all these fines. Not realizing that really most of the penalties come down to if you're actually streaming it. Right? If I am some Joe Schmo who decides to go to one of these sites, let's say I go to It's Lil Brandon and watch an illegal stream of the Triller Jake Paul versus Penn Askren pay-per-view, Triller's not coming after me. It would make no sense to come after me. The amount of money they would spend in court coming after me is less than the amount the average Joe who's streaming this is going to be able to pay them. It's a loss for them. And there have been cases where they have done that. The movie industry did that early on, right? For torrenting and downloading movies. It's more about sending a message. I think this is their sending the message, though. I think it's, hey, we're going after we're naming these 12 guys. We're going after them to deter anyone else from trying to do this, because they know they're going to end up with a, judgment or a, notice of a lawsuit. And it's really what it comes down to, is to get those people and those Joe Schmoes that don't realize that, hey, I can watch this and I'm almost assuredly fine from watching an illegal stream. Instead, they're going to be like, well, I don't want to get in trouble, so I'm going to go ahead and pay for it. That's part of what it is. It's PR. It's a PR move, and it's a tactic of deterrence rather than a tactic of, compensation for what happened with these illegal streams. So that's what's going on with the Triller world. Don't be shocked if, I don't know how long it will take to get through the court system, because again, U.S. court system is a little slow, as we know from the antitrust lawsuit. But I wouldn't be shocked if in several weeks or a couple months, you end up reading Triller wins summary judgment for $100 million. But keep in mind, them actually getting $100 million and collecting it from these guys, very, very unlikely. All right, next thing I want to cover quickly here is that according to the Endeavor Roadshow, it turns out the UFC ESPN pay-per-view guarantee is less than we originally thought. So if you go back a couple of years when, ESPN essentially bought the exclusive rights to show UFC pay-per-views through ESPN Plus, was a lot of talk around a guarantee rate that ESPN was paying the UFC that equated to something like 500,000 buys or something like that in terms of pay-per-views, where UFC would allow ESPN Plus to be the exclusive distributor of this content as long as they got the equivalent of every event, averaging out to be around 500,000 buys. And that's a huge part of the deal. It really helped, take even more of that variable revenue out of the equation and make it a fixed, constant revenue stream for the UFC, which is what the entire UFC ESPN deal was about. It was not just, yes, they want to get on ESPN because it's, the major sports network in the US, but much more, it was about taking that crazy variable cost of, variable cost and revenue, more importantly, of pay-per-views out of the day-to-day operations of the business. So you didn't have to worry about convincing Conor McGregor to show up and deal with a bunch of stuff when he didn't feel like doing media day for UFC 200. So you didn't have to say, man, that's going to cost us a ton of money and that's going to really hurt our bottom line when Conor doesn't show up. I mean, it's always a bad day when Conor McGregor pulls out of a fight or, gets moved or pushed back or any of that, right? But it's much, much different back then in UFC 200 versus now. And a lot of that comes down to this fixed revenue stream and the deals the UFC has been making over the past 3 or 4 years. So according to the Endeavor Roadshow presentation, which this was pointed out by, of course, John Nash, who is the guru of all of MMA business topics and knows everyone and all of that. He pointed out that according to the prospectus, $160 million in revenue was transferred from performance to media rights in 2019. And that didn't include the first 2 pay-per-views because the deal started April 2019. So it's a little bit more than half of the $200 million figure that was talked about in terms of translating to around 500,000 buys or so. So still way below that, though. That's really Nash's point, is the amount of guaranteed money we thought the UFC was getting per event, where it was, oh yeah, they basically get 500K buys every event. That's not the case. It's more like, at this point, maybe 300K buys, if I'm doing the math correctly, which I believe I am. And that's a big difference. That goes more to the hardcore floor I talked about, where, prior to this exclusive distribution deal, you had several pay-per-views and kind of a couple years where 200K, 250K was kind of the norm. Maybe 300K if it's a bigger fight, 400K if it's something like Stipe versus DC. I think the first one did 400K or so. But in general, closer to that 200 to 300,000 range for pay-per-view buys. And this, honestly, with this new information, it makes sense to me. I couldn't understand when they were looking at the average of a particular year and saying, yeah, we've looked at the average of a particular year, so we're going to go with 500,000 pay-per-view buys, right? And what I mean by that is ESPN looked through UFC's financials, at least the financials they were given, and said, okay, we've now seen about a year or so of pay-per-view buys, so we'll average it out to this, and we'll give you that flat rate. And I couldn't understand why it was 500,000 buys. The only thing that I could think of at the time was, okay, you've got Conor, you've got Adesanya pulling in more, John Jones, you've got the bigger stars that can draw more, especially Conor and Khabib at the time, right? And that kind of made me think, okay, so they're going to bump that up because you're not guaranteed to see Conor McGregor in the octagon in a particular year, or have a John Jones fight that draws a million pay-per-view buys, rivalry, that type of thing, or have another star like an Adesanya really, command pay-per-view buys and kind of break out and be a bigger star in the sport than most other champions. So I kind of just said, okay, yeah, all right, that makes sense, I guess. But it still didn't sit quite right with me, because you would have figured that ESPN would have had a little bit more leverage in terms of saying, no, we need to go with what the average event will be. Because remember, after that certain threshold, the UFC still ends up getting a chunk of any pay-per-view buys after that initial number. So, if it was 500,000 buys, but then let's say Conor did perform and gets up 1.3 million against Cerrone, right? UFC is getting a cut of the revenue from that difference of 1.3 versus 500K, so 700,000 buys. So it still didn't really make a lot of sense to me as to why they went that high. Now it's making a little bit more sense. If you have it closer to 300K or so, that's more of that hardcore floor of, yes, this is, what a particular pay-per-view might do in a certain month. It is averages out between, championship fights where maybe, or champion versus champion fights, or, championship fights where maybe there's enough of a rivalry, it bumps it up, things like that. That all makes much, much more sense now. And, it does affect the way we look at the UFC getting money, where it turns out more of their revenue than we thought is variable still, but not so much that it's, going to make them worry about how many pay-per-view buys they're selling on any given event, right? It's still that floor. They're still kind of secure in that amount of money. They still want to make as much money as possible. They still want to promote stars, all of that, especially with Endeavor buying them now. That's more important than ever. But it's a little bit more variable than we first thought. Not to the point where it's going to, keep them awake at night if they're consistently doing in that 200K to 300K range or lower, right? You do have stars or particular matchups that don't do well at all. And then they make some money. They end up making a profit. That's part of what that base is. That 300K base is, we get beyond that. Okay, we get a share, split it, all of that. But if we, end up selling below, well, hey, we made more money on that event than we would have before. And that's taking out that variability again, which is what the whole deal was about. So important to note, something to keep an eye on as, Endeavor looks to buy out the rest of the UFC, especially because Endeavor needs as much revenue as it can get, and finding out that more of the UFC's revenue is variable versus fixed is bad for them. But, not something that's going to really change the game for the UFC right now, and more of okay, this makes more business sense when this deal was originally done. So that's the update there. Next thing I want to talk about is Proximo Spirits buying out the majority share of Proper 12 in a deal worth up to $600 million. So if you haven't heard the news, Proximo Spirits, which originally had a 49% stake in Proper 12, has officially bought the majority stake, and we don't know exactly how much they own. Right? We knew they had 49% before this deal. We don't know the exact percentage, but I mean, the deal being worth up to $600 million is a very, very big deal for Conor McGregor and for the brand itself. It shows how popular Proper 12 has been since McGregor launched the brand, and it really highlights something that very few in MMA are able to do. And that's take their brand and name and turn it into a product that really flies off the shelves, really, ends up making more money than Conor probably ever did in the octagon, right? Now, we see this more often nowadays, where you've got Adesanya with the Puma deal, you've got Jorge Masvidal with his tequila, right? You do see this happen. You see a lot more of the top UFC guys making these moves, but McGregor really highlighted for the breakout star that you can make a killing with a product, especially if it's marketed well and it, fits the brand that you've already built. Part of what Proper 12 and, you think of Conor McGregor and you think of how rowdy he is and you think of, his bravado and all of that, like it makes sense that he would have his own whiskey. It's something that falls in line with his brand and the brand he's sold in the octagon. And yes, he is by far away the biggest star in the UFC, so it's not surprising that that product took off more than others. But I think that that's something that a lot of bigger names in MMA miss, is you've got guys going out there and coming up with products. Well, take, for example, the McGregor Fast system, right? That he's promoting now between the trilogy with Dustin Poirier. When you think of Conor McGregor and his image and his brand, a system to, eat healthy and train and do these things kind of fits, right? It fits, but not really as well as something like whiskey. Because the persona he's built is this, unapologetic, brash Irishman who backs up all the trash talk that he throws out there all the time. And, you can see a guy like that having his own whiskey, pouring back shots, having a party, especially with, you look at some of his earlier fights when he won fights, he'd go have these massive after parties. It really fits the brand. It's like the Diaz brothers doing, the weed strain and all that stuff. Makes perfect sense. That fits the Diaz brothers brand. With everything they said coming up and everything that they, did in the octagon, outside of the octagon, something like that really seems to fit. A lot of these stars try and go for everything. Or try and go after brands that don't necessarily match up well with the persona they've made in the octagon. And make no mistake, with a lot of these guys too, it's a persona, right? Chael Sonnen is not, his persona in real life every day. But Conor McGregor is not his persona in real life every day. But the brand they've built and what they're doing, those two in particular have done a good job at picking things like, Conor's whiskey and doing, or Chael doing the Bad Guy Incorporated and all of that. Like, that's all things that you just see and they click. They make sense. And it's basically anything you would see in a business where if I'm, Toyota and I'm making cars, I'm not going to go and make car seats necessarily. Like, yeah, that fits because they go in cars and all that, but they're not really what Toyota is known for. It's got to line up with the brand. So this is a prime example of utilizing your brand to the fullest extent, getting a buyout, which I also think is important, rather than trying to run this company and continue to grow it. He wants it, McGregor wants this to be a multi-million case brand, he says, and I believe him in that, but, he's not going to be a full-time, hands-on, CEO who's running the whiskey business when he's also trying to do fighting and all that other stuff, right? It makes sense to create this product, use your brand to sell it, make it hugely successful, which he's done, and then get a buyout for a ton of money. And he's staying on, right? Proximo Spirits is taking the majority share, but they're keeping Conor McGregor on to help sell it. He's still going to be the face of the brand. It's still going to be his baby, as he put it in an Instagram post. He still gets to work on it and do all that stuff. He might have to listen to the new owners if they want something done in particular. But at the same time, who's going to necessarily mess with that image and that type of thing? They're really there to do more of the distribution and the operational stuff that Conor wouldn't do anyway. So it's very likely Conor gets to keep the same, job he's had for Proper 12 in terms of promotion, marketing, and, having his say here and there. And yet he's getting paid a bunch of money for it. Money he wouldn't otherwise see for, years upon years. Great move. And this is something that I think, again, a lot of fighters can learn from, is find your brand. Find your brand and find a product within that brand and go for it. Don't go for any other, offer. Well, sorry, let me back that up. Don't go for every offer you see out there. If you got a good offer for a particular, product that doesn't really make sense, you can do a, benefit cost analysis and decide whether or not it's worth the money. But where you're going to really find that key critical success is finding a product that lines up with the brand so well. And Proper 12 getting bought out by Proximo Spirits is a prime example of that. So I do think it may affect his, ability to be more willing to fight. I mean, he doesn't need to, right? He's got enough ventures, obviously, with this going on. He's got enough money he can retire and just quit it any day. But this gives him more of a cushion to kind of sit back and relax. And maybe if he doesn't like a particular offer, doesn't feel like dealing with some of the hassles of a particular fight offer, he'll just say, nah, I don't want to do with that. I feel like it could sway him a little bit that way. But I also don't foresee it stopping him from getting back into the octagon again, right? He's going to do the trilogy with Dustin. After that, I still expect him to, either go again for the belt at 155, or he's talked about moving up to 170 and fighting Usman. Who knows with all that? And that's all if he wins, right? If he loses, you've always got the Diaz trilogy. You've got some options there, but I don't think this hurts him too much in terms of his incentive to get back in there, because he already has enough money to do that, or should, unless he's bloated all, in which case, but it certainly makes it more likely he won't put up with things that he views as, unacceptable. I would say that. And who knows, again, it's worth up to $600 million. So the exact number of the deal, we don't know. And the exact majority stake that Proximo Spirits bought from Proper 12, we're not sure of. We don't know those full numbers, but it gives Conor more cushion for sure. And, we'll just have to see what happens after UFC 264, July 10th, and see where he's at. But don't expect Conor to take any fights that with terms he deems as unacceptable, especially after this deal. That is what I will say in terms of how it affects Conor personally. Next thing I want to hit quickly here is the One on TNT event series. So we've talked about this a little bit on the podcast before, but last night we had the One on TNT 4 event happen. And from a business perspective, these events have not gone well at all. You've got ratings coming in for these events that are nowhere near what you would hope for, especially given the marketing that One has poured into this, right? They had commercials during the Final Four about One Championship on TNT, yet ratings were 196,000. They did bump up on One on TNT 2 and, that type of stuff, but still not the type of ratings that are really knocking it out of the park and justify that type of advertising costs. Then from just a, show and event standpoint, you had the Eddie Alvarez controversial DQ for One on TNT 1. Alvarez now comes back and fights, and I'm going to butcher his name. I'm just going to call him OK. Ray Jan OK. Again, I apologize for butchering names. I'm awful at it. But he comes back for One on TNT 4 and fights OK here. And OK, almost finishes him in the first round and wins a unanimous decision. Despite Alvarez, weathering the storm, coming back and trying to wrestle and mounting some good offense in rounds 2 and 3, still kind of a clear decision in the judge's mind that, didn't go Alvarez's way. That's somebody you paid a lot of money for. According to Alvarez, it was 8 figures. I don't buy that unless it's made up of, stock that they priced at some ridiculous amount or something. I'm not sure I buy 8 figures for for Alvarez. If who knows if we'll ever figure that out for certain. But, you paid a lot of money for this guy when you got him from the UFC. And he has now just, had a real rough go of it. A really rough go of it. Not, put on the types of performances you hope for. You didn't get you're not going to get the Alvarez Christian Lee matchup that, everyone and one especially is clamoring for. It's just not happening. And that's bad, especially with the amount of money that you paid for him. So there's that. Then you obviously had the, Demetrius Johnson knockout, which you could go either way there because you had one of your homegrown guys and, end up beating who many consider the GOAT. So I think that could be more of a net positive. But the other fights from one on TNT 4, right? You had Rug, who, just wasn't able to execute his game plan, and then had the throat punch. I'm not one to lightly throw around accusations of someone faking an injury or faking damage to them. But looking at the replay, looking at the way he talked and then grabbed his throat and went down, it certainly seemed like Rug wanted out. And that's bad too, because he was a, big social media driver. They were, looking to push him, and for him to get beaten in that way and just get stuffed and kind of just outclassed is bad for for an upcoming prospect that you hope to push and that was gaining some momentum for you. So that didn't go well for the promotion. And then you had in the main event De Ridder versus Hong Long Song, and De Ridder, comes in with his grappling, and of course I'm just talking the main card. Aoki winning on the prelims is probably good for business, but De Ridder and Ong fight, and De Ridder's just able to kind of dominate. Just wasn't able to get the submission. It was good improvements from Ong, but kind of dominates, gets the win, takes both of Ong's belts. This was a short notice fight because, Big Dash, I believe is his name, pulled out last minute. And so this was a short notice fight. And I think the hope here is that Ong can beat De Ridder at 205. He's going to be heavier, bigger. This is short notice for De Ridder. And, Ong's been training, so he can hopefully beat De Ridder here and then retain a belt and still be a champion that the promotion can push. But De Ridder just, again, utilized mostly the same game plan, just took longer, got a decision rather than a submission, and took away both belts from Ong. That's huge. Myanmar is a massive market for one championship. It is a huge part of their audience, and Ong was their, biggest star in that region by far. So for him to lose back-to-back and lose both belts, so he's no longer even a champion, it's a bad time for the promotion, especially when you consider what happened with Alvarez and with Rug. So all in all, this just shows, they spent a lot of money trying to break into the North American market. They got the deal done with TNT. They're going to have a couple other events on in May. I believe 2 other events in May. But it's just not panning out how they hoped. It's not. There's no two ways about it. It's not a good time for the business when you're spending that much money in advertising. You're getting the types of ratings that you're getting, and then the stars you're trying to push all lose. It's going to hurt them. And we've talked about their financials before, right? Lost nearly $100 million in 2019. We don't know 2020 yet, but those losses are probably going to go up. Maybe not because of, the cumulative losses certainly will. How bad 2019 will compare to 2020 will be compared to 2019 depends on, how much marketing they cut off when they stopped doing events and things of that nature. But yeah, it's a rough time for the promotion. So we'll see if they can bounce back. We'll see what they can do with these next two events on TNT that are broadcast. They will be tape delayed. I think that hurts them. But it's not a good start to One Championship's venture into the North American market. And they've got to pivot fast with the way they're burning through cash. What they can pivot to in order to kind of salvage this, I'm not really sure, but they've got to think of something, because right now they're burning through money, and the stars they hoped they were building have all taken a loss, which is never good when all your guys go down. So we'll see what happens, but yeah, keep an eye on One Championship, and don't be surprised if they make some big signings or they try and make some big moves in the next couple of months to try and offset this. I believe that's probably the route they'll go. I don't know who they'll sign or what they'll do or set up. Maybe they'll do a tournament format. Who knows? But they've got to do something, because things are not looking up for them right now. All right. Last thing I want to touch on real quickly is Jon Jones splitting from First Round Management. Now, we have a full video up with Matthew Wells and Ant Walker breaking this down a little bit more. So check that out on our page for a full in-depth discussion with those guys. But just quickly from the business perspective a little bit, it was certainly interesting that Jon Jones has been vocal many times throughout his career about wanting to get paid more. And First Round Management, Melky Kawa, who, is the face of that, has vocally backed him up over and over again. We'll be on Twitter retweeting his stuff. We'll say, we're going to get the best deal, all this stuff. He deserves this much, all of that. This time around, most recently, when Dana said that Jon Jones was asking for $30 million, and Jon said, where did you hear that number? Because I didn't throw it out there. They were silent. Now, I've seen two theories on this. One is that where they got that $30 million number from was First Round Management, and Jones was pissed and was like, why are you telling them $30 million? I'm good with less than that, 15, 20, nuts, we're done, and we're splitting. And two, the other theory is that First Round Management is starting their own promotion, and they're looking to kind of be a UFC feeder league, similar to how LFA and CFFC and some of those other promotions are. And they didn't want to piss off Dana and the UFC, because they're hoping to, have their guys get signed by the UFC where they get paid for it and they get some steady income by providing good prospects to the promotion. I am more inclined to believe the second than the first, just because it seems strange when Jon first vacated the light heavyweight belt, said he was going to move up to fight Francis, and Dana had talked about Deontay Wilder money, and Jon said, I'd fight for half of that. I mean, that was around 15 million, I believe. That was 30 million. Unless I'm wrong here, and I'm pretty sure I'm not, they were talking about, Deontay Wilder's purse being around 30 million guaranteed. And Jones was saying, I'm good with half of that, which would have been 15 million. So that was, a while ago. I can't imagine First Round Management forgot about that, or has been telling Dana the whole time it's $30 million, when Jones publicly on social media said, I'd be fine with half of that purse. If they are, then that is terrible management on their part, and I would understand why Jones would be pissed and they would want to sever for them. So it's a possibility, but that seems like a big oversight on Kawa's part. So I don't really see it. Rather, I think, it probably made sense for Kawa not to, and First Round Management to not challenge the UFC, so that they could look at building, their promotion and having that be a feeder league and all that. And especially with where Jones is in his career, right? You gotta wonder if Jones is dead set on retiring or fighting, at heavyweight for a super fight and getting paid, and that's it. then it's not, a terrible idea to, let him go separate ways and kind of do his own thing and focus on the promotion. I mean, it's never good to lose a client. So there's, especially a client in the name of Jon Jones. So it's not, something's going on there, but it is entirely possible that Jones is only looking for that super fight. And if he doesn't get paid for that super fight, he is walking away. He never lost the light heavyweight belt, remember. He left. He left to go up to heavyweight and try and angle for the super fight. But at one point he talked about, I'll retire. He retires, then okay. Then what's the point? And when you're looking at it from a risk perspective, Jones, hasn't looked the best in his past couple of fights. And he's getting older. And he's had plenty of problems outside the octagon. And you can back him up here and possibly piss off the promotion you're trying to get a deal done with for a completely separate deal. Or you could kind of weigh that and say, you know what? Maybe he's got a couple fights here. Maybe we get some money there. But long term, the better investment is to make sure we're still in good standing with the UFC and we get paid for this feeder league stuff. It's hard to say. I can technically see either of them being true. I lean more towards the second theory because it makes more sense from a long-term investment perspective. You can't look at your clients when you're a manager, when you're a manager in any sport, or even, you could hypothetically say that about music in Hollywood a little bit different. But I mean, especially in sports, your clients have a shelf life, right? Jon Jones, 10 years from now, probably not going to be commanding the same money and attention that he has been. You got Triller kind of proving that wrong a little bit, but how long that sticks around, we'll see, as I've mentioned in other episodes. But the prime of Jon Jones's career is done. And if you are trying to build your business out without him, which a day will come, even if they stuck by Jones through all this and they said, no, we're still, we're with you 100%, and Jones agreed, a day would have come where Jones would have retired and called it quits. And then that money's gone for first round management. Something like a feeder league, though, that money, if you set it up correctly, that money never goes away. Now, we're not talking the same amount they command from a manager's fee from somebody that's selling like 1 million pay-per-views, right? But the long-term investment in it could end up yielding, depending on what the various deals are for them signing, for the UFC signing one of their guys, just like they do with Cage Warriors, just like they do with LFA, it could end up being very profitable. And it's steady. So I'm going to go with theory number 2. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, why you think Jones and Kawa split. And again, watch the full video with Ant and Matt. They break it down, discuss it, have a good conversation about it, and obviously have some different opinions. So check that out as well. But would love to know your guys' thoughts on that, because I've seen a lot of different things being thrown around, and I'm just curious as to the reasoning behind it. If you think it is theory 1, let me know why, especially. Or if you think it's another theory I haven't mentioned, definitely drop it in here and let me know, because I'd love to see your guys' perspective on it. All right, that wraps up another episode of the Fight Business Podcast. Thank you so much for watching or listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that like button, subscribe, bell notification, check out our other videos. If you're listening on Spotify, Podcast Addict, Apple Podcasts, Anchor, what have you, appreciate it as always. And until next time, guys, get money.